Record. All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to our fourth webinar in our Solar Circuit 2026 series. If you're new here, we're HelioHub. We're a Discord community for undergrads, recent grads, and literally anyone interested in heliophysics. My name is Claudia, and I'm joined by my my colleague Phoebe, as usual. Oh my gosh. And Dan, who's also usually co-hosts these, couldn't make it today, but just wanted to shout him out. This summer, we've been hosting a series of professional development workshops and webinars featuring heliophysics researchers and professionals and today's is the fourth in our series. If you missed any of the previous workshops and webinars, don't worry, you can find them pinned in our programming channel on the Discord server. And if you're not in our Discord server yet, I'll send the link in a few minutes. And just before I introduce our speaker for today, if you have any questions during this webinar, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Phoebe and I will make sure we ask Dr. Bryan Mendez them. And then finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bryan Mendez, an astronomer and public education specialist at the UC Berkeley Space Sciences Laboratory. Dr. Mendez is dedicated to educating and inspiring others about the wonder and beauty of the universe. In his role at the UC Berkeley Space Sciences Laboratory, he develops educational programs and resources for students, teachers, and the public, leads professional development for science educators, and serves as an adjunct professor of astronomy and physics at Bay Area colleges. He earned his bachelor degrees in astronomy, physics, and music from the University of Michigan before pursuing graduate studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where he received his Ph.D. in astrophysics in 2002. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Mendez.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and welcome everybody. And oh my goodness, it's so fun seeing some of the names and some old friends here. That's so cool. You mentioned my degree in music, and I, in fact, see one of my old band directors is
I
here.
was gonna say I recognize your name from like band camp. Like, are you? I mean, I know Dr. Lefevre, but
Okay, good.
yes. Hello.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm here to tell you all about a different aspect of the sun than some of the other lectures you've heard about. You've heard technical things about modern scientific knowledge. And what I'm going to talk about is how we have processed that knowledge in a cultural way over the course of human history. And I'll talk about that in several different ways. Let me get my slide deck rolling. Okay. And as was mentioned, please, if you've got questions, drop them in the chat or raise a hand or something. We'll save some time at the end for questions, but I like to also address things, um, right in the moment as they become appropriate. So, if you've got a thought, drop it in there, and we'll try to address it. In fact, let's test out your chatting abilities. One of the things that I want to talk about is the name of the sun itself. And I'd like you to drop in the chat what are some names of the sun that you know, either in another language or another culture? Like, what are some names of the sun? All right, I see French and Hindi, Spanish. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's German. We're getting some good ones here. Is that Italian? Oh, I'll have to ask about Eli's. I don't know that one. Ra, yes, good, Kevin. Oh, couple here that I don't know. Excellent. And these are all great. And the reason that I like to start off and ask this is because, the sun is obviously something that all of us, for all of history, have seen and interacted with. It's the most important thing in our sky, right? Um, and we all have names for it and different traditions around it. And one of the things that always strikes me as kind of funny is those of us who speak English have this weird notion that the sun doesn't have a name, like that sun is like, or if you ask people what's the name of the sun, they'll tell you, oh, it's Sol. And my response to that is always, well, yeah, that's the name of it in Latin and Latin languages, but do you know what it is in English? People are always like, no. And I'm like, well, it's the sun. Sun is its name in English, and it comes from a character from Norse traditions whose name was Suna. And she has a twin brother named Moni, and the two of them, like in many traditions, in fact, are you know siblings, the sun and the moon. So Suna is the goddess of the sun. She carries the sun across the sky in a horse-drawn chariot, and her brother Moni does the same thing. And so that's where the name Sun comes from in English. It comes from this character. She was renamed Sol as Roman Empire was spreading across Europe and Latin traditions were taking hold, but the name of Suna still stayed in a lot of Germanic languages and is why we still have that name for this object. So sun is not just some label, it's the name. One of the things that's kind of fascinating about the story of Suna and Moni is that the reason that they're constantly on the move is because they're being chased by wolves who intend to consume them. And when Ragnarok comes, the death of the gods, they will finally reach and consume them. But let's go ahead and mention someone I saw put it in there. Liana put it up. Helios. So, in the Greco-Roman tradition, there are a set of characters who have a lot of similarities, and then occasionally they have some different qualities. But among the original Titans in this mythology, there was a character who drove the sun across the sky. In fact, he kind of was the sun, like his head glowed of the sun's radiance, and the Greeks called him Helios, and the Romans then renamed him Sol, and eventually he became known as Sol Invictus, and he was actually the um, kind of figure. He was like the symbol of the Roman Empire, and you'd see his image on coins. And so, in fact, here's an image here in the corner of an ancient Roman coin with the symbol there of Sol Invictus imprinted upon it. He's got the radiance of the sun protruding from his head. In other traditions, Sol was eventually replaced by one of the Olympians, Adonis, or that's his Greek name, or Apollo in Latin traditions. Um, Kind of carrying on the tradition for Helios, Adonis takes over. So of course, this is where the name, of our the hub program here, the HelioHub, gets its name, right? It comes from that Greek root. And then, of course, all the things when we refer to the sun, we often refer to them as being solar, and that obviously comes from the Latin name for the sun. In China, the sun is known as Taiyang, and one of the traditions about the sun is that it began as more than one object. In fact, there were 10 of them, and they were all children of the goddess Shiha. And these children were radiant balls who had legs, 3 legs. They were like crow's legs. And each morning, Shiha would go over into the east and she would collect one of her children and put it on her carriage, which would then be carried across the sky, being driven instead of by horses. This time it was driven by a dragon. And, most of the time it was a very orderly process. She drives them across the sky and then returns them back to the east. And each day she goes and she picks another one of her children to be the sun for that day. But the story goes that one day the children were unruly and they all decided to get into the sky at the same time. And it was the day of 10 suns. And it began to burn the earth. And the great hero, Li Hu, uh, or no, I got that backwards. Hu Li, uh, he was an archer, and he was requested to go out and help and save the world, and so he took his arrows and shot down 9 of the 10 sons so that he could save the world and leave behind only the one son. I'm doing a theme here, as you might see. In India, there is also a tradition of the sun being carried across the sky by a character who's in a chariot driven by horses. His name is Surya, and in this case, he has a couple of accomplices. He's got some oh, almost angelic-like figures who flank him on either side, firing arrows and chasing away the darkness. Uh, and so it's pretty interesting, I think, that there are several traditions across the world that have this notion of the sun being carried across the sky um, by some in a chariot of some kind, not always driven by horses, but usually some kind of beast is moving that chariot. But as someone mentioned, there are other traditions. So if we go to Egypt and go way back in Egypt, the sun was known as Ra, and the sun itself, the disk of the sun, was sometimes considered to be like the eye of Ra, constantly looking down upon us. Um, and then in later traditions, Ra became this figure who has a falcon's head and a human's body, and then the sun sits atop his head. Um, in later eras of Egyptian culture, there became this tradition that the pharaohs themselves were like avatars of Ra on Earth. And so the sun became strongly associated with the pharaohs themselves, and they would be known as the sons of Ra. Japan actually gets its name from the sun itself. It's kind of interesting because Japan's name, Nippon, uh, comes from its location relative to China. It's east of China, and therefore in China, the sun rises from where Japan is located in the east, right? And so its name literally means the place where the sun rises from. In English, it's often translated as the land of the rising sun. And one of the things that I think is particularly noteworthy about that tradition is, of course, the national symbol of Japan is the rising sun, a red sun. Sun looks red when it's on the horizon because the atmosphere scatters away all of the shorter wavelengths, and so you end up with the blues. The reason that the sky is blue is because the blues have been taken out of the sunlight, right? So when the sun is right on the horizon, it has that orangish and even sometimes red color. And what I think is really interesting about that is that, here in the United States in particular, we've got this notion of the sun being a yellow object. And one of my one one of my pet peeves is the notion that the sun is an average yellow star. And as any student of mine will tell you, that is not true in any sense. The sun is not average, the sun is not yellow. Um, and that yellow sun is somewhat of a cultural idea because, if you ask a kid in the United States to pick up here's a crayon box, draw me a picture of the sun, they will reach kind of instinctively for the yellow crayon. But if you were to ask a student in Japan to reach for a crayon, they might as well pick out the red one because culturally they think about the sun rising, right? And that red sun is then incorporated into that notion. Um, Going over to the Americas, the Maya people have also different traditions about the sun depending on the era and the time. It's very common, you'll see that cultures that last a long time end up coming up with lots of different traditions about astronomical objects. But one of the traditions that is somewhat more modern in the sense that it's like only 1,000 years old as opposed to maybe 3,000 years old is the tradition of how the sun and the moon came to be in the current creation of the world. And again, it's a story of twins. And often, I should mention that often when the sun and moon are seen as twins, it's like a brother and sister. In the case of the Norse mythology, it was the sister who's the sun and the brother who's the moon. It's inverted for the Greeks, right? So Sol Invictus is the sun, and the twin sister is Luna. But here in Mesoamerica, and particularly in the Maya lands, they had the twin brothers, Hunapu and Xpalanque. And there's some ancient plate here with pictures of the two of them on it. And here's also a relief. This is actually it's a cylindrical vase, and so the image on it has been flattened out for you to see. They're twins, of course, so they're hard to tell apart. But the one way you can tell them apart is that Spelunky has the spots like a jaguar. And these two twins have they're the sons of a god, the god of corn, and the god of corn has died and gone to the underworld, and the two brothers decide that they want to go down to the underworld and save him, bring him back. When they go down there, the lords of the underworld, they try to challenge them to all kinds of games and things, and the brothers do a lot of tricks, use a lot of magic. Their favorite trick is actually to die and then resurrect. And they kept doing this in the Lords of the Underworld, which is called Xibalba in Yucatec Maya. The Lords of the Underworld were like so impressed with this trick. They were like, "Oh, show us how to do it! Show us how to do it!" So the brothers killed the gods, and then they didn't resurrect them. And then they got their father's skull, and they brought it back, and they watered it, and it grew back, and he became. You can see in this picture, their father is growing like from the earth itself, which is kind of like a seed, and they're growing from it, and they're tending to him, watering him. After this moment, when they bring their father back to life, they decide, all right, our adventures are done, and they rise up into the sky, and they become the sun and the moon. And one of the interesting things about this plate is that it depicts that kind of moment, and it shows this seed, which is also a representation of the earth and also a representation of kind of a turtle, by the way, which is another symbol of the earth in Maya traditions. You'll see that the moon and the sun are on opposite sides of it, which is a full moon configuration. And in Maya traditions, the day of creation was a full moon. One of the things I like to point out after telling people about Maya traditions that this image here is not a Maya calendar. There are so many times when I see this image and people are talking about the Mayan calendar predicted blah blah blah, and I'm like, okay, well, I know you don't know what you're talking about because um, first of all, calendars don't predict anything, and but maybe not first of all, that's probably third of all. First of all, it's not Maya, and second of all, it's not a calendar. This is Aztec. And this is called Piedra del Sol, or the Sunstone. Sometimes it's also called the Altar of Azcayatl. And the one of the things that's important to know is that the Aztecs and Maya were not the same people. They existed in different parts of Mesoamerica in different time periods. They have similar roots in their culture, and so there's a lot of similarities. It's somewhat akin to like the Greek Roman connection, but it's not quite the same. But this stone, which has become kind of a national symbol of Mexico, the coloration you see here is kind of a recreation of what we think the actual altar was probably painted like. And that's what the stone we believe was. It was an altar that was used for ceremony, public ceremonies. It's a giant stone, the original itself. Um, and it has a lot of solar uh, uh, aspects to it, which is why it's called the Sunstone. And primarily, the central figure who you see here, his name is Tonatiuh, and he is the god of the sun, or a god of the sun. Sometimes the Aztecs had different deities who kind of stood in for the sun at different times. But Tonatiuh here has a tongue made of flint, which you can use, of course, to start fires. And so he's a fiery guy. Tonatiuh is, and you can see these rays coming off of him that represent kind of the rays of the sun. And then one of the reasons people call this a calendar is because there are dates written on it. In fact, this whole cross here is a date, and these dots here represent the number. It's the date is 4, and then this symbol means movement. So that's one of the dates of creation. Inside each of these boxes is another date of creation. And so what this stone is really about is this kind of a marker, a monument to creation itself. And the sun is at the center of that monument of creation. Other symbols of the sun that I'd like to point out that are kind of interesting. So the flag of New Mexico is this red sun with the red rays on a field of yellow. And it was a symbol of the native Zia people from the American Southwest and has made its way into the culture through the actual flag of the state of New Mexico. And another favorite of mine and any other astronomers out there would be the old circle with the dot in it. This is was a very ancient Mediterranean symbol for the sun. And of course, in modern astronomy, we now use it as the symbol for the sun. So all of our equations that we that we write when we are referring to things like, in this case, the luminosity and the mass of the sun, we put the circle with the dot in it to mean sun. I always like to point out that culture is not ancient, that culture is always with us. And there are modern depictions of the sun which are worth kind of considering and enjoying. So I always talk to my students about the yellow, I complain about the whole yellow sun thing, but it's of course super important to the story of Superman, right? Superman is powered by the sun itself. And so, he's a celestial being who draws his energy from the sun. And that's a pretty in some sense, if you tell the story of Superman just right, then it sounds like any other tradition in any other cultural way. So Superman, I think, is our modern version of one of these um, cultural stories. I always like to bring up science fiction because science fiction is a huge part of modern pop culture, and the sun shows up in a variety of ways. One of my favorite ways is that in the Star Trek universe, the gravity of the sun can be used to create a time warp, and they've done that in several different episodes of the TV shows as well as one of the movies, Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. They use the sun as a time travel device. And then another one that I think is pretty interesting because it combines some different notions is the modern. I mean, the idea of vampires isn't totally modern. It's been around for hundreds of years, but it's still very of large interest to popular culture. The idea of vampires, right? And vampires are essentially allergic to the sun, and maybe that's underselling it, right? The sun destroys them. And part of that mythos is because the sun itself, in many cultures, and especially in a lot of Europe, is a stand-in for God. And in the cultures that in Europe that generated the vampire stories, the idea was that the vampires are cursed by God and they're not allowed to be in God's presence, right? And so that's why they can't be in the sun. Because if they're in the sun, then that's it, their existence is destroyed. One of the things that I find kind of interesting is that in modern versions of storytelling about vampires is they try to science it up and come up with, instead of the curse, they have a science reason for why the sun burns them and not just like lights in a room. And the explanation in let's see, I can't remember the author's name, but there was the HBO television show that was based on this one author who wrote lots and lots of vampire novels. It was called True Blood. And like they decided that it was the ultraviolet light from the sun that actually burns the vampires. And in those stories, the humans had learned, oh, this is a way to punish vampires, right? Break out the black lights and you can ward off vampires. Since we've got an eclipse coming up in 1 week, right? We are now like I think today was the third quarter moon, so the moon's now just 7 days from getting right in front of the sun. We won't get to see it here on this side of the world, but over in Spain, they will see it, as well as right off the coast of Iceland and piece of northern Greenland will get to see a total solar eclipse next week. So I thought I'd share a couple of interesting ideas about eclipses. In particular, I wanted to point out that eclipses have historically been seen as bad omens, right? The sun disappearing is not a good thing. So, it's kind of a modern thing that now we, want to travel and see them because they're amazing events. But when they would happen, especially before people had developed, ways to predict them, um, they were often a scary thing. And so a lot of traditions imagine that the eclipses are caused by some kind of great monster in the sky who's consuming the sun. And so let me give you a rundown of some of the various monsters. So I actually started out telling you about Suna and Mauni being chased by the wolves. And of course, when the wolves finally reach them and consume them, that's a metaphor for an eclipse. And so presumably Ragnarok will happen during an eclipse. In Korea, the celestial king sends out fire dogs to eat the sun or the moon, and that is the explanation for eclipses there. In Vietnam, it's a giant toad who's out there eating the sky or eating the sun. Let's see, we've got dragons in both Mongolia, or not both, but in Mongolia, Persia, and the Baltics. All imagine that it's a dragon who's up there consuming the sun. It's often kind of mistakenly misremembered or misreported that a dragon is also the Chinese tradition, but like the Korean tradition in China, it's again dogs sent by the Celestial Empire Emperor. Um, and you might imagine sometimes, the monster is not necessarily monstrous, but it's kind of a more monstrous version of animals that are in your own environment. So for several native Californian uh, um, tribes, it was either coyotes or bears who were up there eating the sun. Sometimes it's just a sky monster who has no, earthly counterpart. So in the Dakota Sioux, for example, it's just the sky monster who eats the sun. The Maya, there's actually a picture from a Maya glyph here that shows this kind of serpenty-like creature who's trying to consume this symbol, and this symbol we see throughout Maya writings, which refers to eclipses. And down in Bolivia, it's a puma because pumas are very common in that part of the world. And one of my favorites is it's a Hindu tradition, which is also taken root in Indonesia. And it's the idea that there's one of the gods who turned against the other gods. He was decapitated. His name is Rahu, and he's in the sky. And he actually sits at one of the eclipse nodes. And so when the sun or the moon venture into his area, he will consume them and eat them. But the thing that I love about this is because he's a severed head, they fall through his neck. So that's why they always return. They always return because he can't, he doesn't have a body to actually digest them. So they just go through his mouth and then out his neck. It's not always monsters. In Mesopotamia, it was demons who were holding the sun hostage. And that idea of holding the sun hostage is interesting because there's a bunch of traditions in all of these sky monsters that the community has to do something about this, right? It isn't we shouldn't just sit in terror and watch as, a monster consumes the sun. We need to go out and do something about it. We have to bang pots and pans, shoot fireworks, make a lot of noise, scare that thing away. And the modern version of that is even shooting guns, which is probably not advisable. But yeah, that's a tradition that you see in a lot of these places across the world around eclipses. I'm going to pause there, in fact, because I know I've mentioned several different things and I want to just check in and see if anyone has any questions before I move to a different topic.
I was just wondering, my name is Gwen. I was just wondering, is there a lot of like cross culture, like like suns and like moons where that happens?
I mean, that's when, whenever you study culture, you always have to recognize that people are in contact with each other and they share cultural ideas, right? So, traditions, especially as I said, when a culture lives a really long time, they will generate lots of traditions, and sometimes those traditions are because of cross-cultural sharing. And so, for example, the Greek and Roman traditions, the Romans had their own set of gods. They didn't just like take their Greeks and copy them. But when, there was when the Greeks and Romans began strongly trading with each other and trading stories, they began, there began this process of Romans kind of like taking the Greek stories and putting their own characters into them, right? Um, and so, this idea, for example, of the sun being carried across the sky in a chariot is one of those things that makes me wonder, is that something that somebody heard someone telling, when they were on one of their journeys trading goods, and they thought, oh, well, that's an interesting story, and then they tell that when they come home and it spreads and gets a life of its own. That's the kind of thing that certainly happens, right? And so, it's in as far as when cultures are in contact with each other, there's certainly this opportunity, right, for the sharing of ideas and for that kind of mixing to occur. For example, there's lots of stories generated about the sky in China that you end up finding the exact same story throughout, Korea, Japan. You'll see it in Indonesia, even. It'll be the same story, it just has different characters' names, and maybe it has a slightly different, uh, you know, um, moral to it, right? Because sometimes the morals of the stories change as well. You see, there's a comment too. Is there a deeper connection between archery and the sun in several different cultures? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, the idea of using arrows to fight off things in the sky. I suppose, especially with our ancestors, that was probably the best tool you had to strike at a distance, right? Since the sky is so high away. But that's an interesting question worth digging into. Any other questions? All right. Well, I know a lot of people are often interested in the architecture aspect, and so I wanted to tell you a few examples of architecture built into, or solar alignments built into architecture around the world. And there's a fun name that was invented to describe this idea called hierophany. And it's actually, you can see the quote here on the bottom of the slide from the originator, Mircea Eliade. It's the idea that there's something sacred that you can reveal um, through the simplicity of things, right? And so shadows and light can reveal some kind of deeper connection with nature. And the example that's on this slide is a fairly recognizable structure. This is the Great Pyramid in the Maya city of Chichen Itza, and it's called the Temple of Kukulkan because the character of Kukulkan, who's a feathered serpent, is only on one side of this pyramid, which um, is significant because everywhere else throughout the city, Kukulkan is on every single building and he faces all directions. But this is the only one where he only faces to the north. And there's this really cool effect that happens on the equinoxes. On the equinoxes, the shadow of the building casts onto the staircase side here and creates this undulating shape as though the snake itself is slithering down the the temple, and the direction that he faces is the Grand Cenote, which is one of the sources of fresh water for the city. And the idea that is being evoked here, Kukulkan is one of the he's one of the deities associated with creation. And so the idea is that on this special day, the energy of creation from the cosmos is coming to Earth and fertilizing the ground. Because when this happens in the equinox, especially the spring equinox, it's time to begin the agricultural cycle. So it's now a huge celebration. Thousands of people show up there every equinox to witness the serpent's descent. Um, Going way back, the oldest known deliberate alignment with the sun comes from this tomb in Ireland called Newgrange. And it's about 5,200 years old. And the people who built it don't they're not around, and they didn't leave any written um, descriptions of what their lives were like and what this tomb was all about. And so it's one of these things where you have to take all of the things that you can observe and try to piece together as best you can what's going on there. The alignment is this: there's an opening, there's a doorway that goes into the tomb, and then above the doorway there's this window. And only on the sunrise of the winter solstice does the sun go directly through that window and illuminates one of the inner tombs. And that's pretty it's pretty clear cut that that was intentional. But what does it mean? Uh, we don't know. Right. Because, like I said, the people didn't leave behind any information about that. And that's one of the things that I always caution people who are doing this kind of astronomy, called archaeoastronomy, about, is that, it's people have a lot of different reasons for doing things. And it's a little well, dangerous isn't quite the word, but you can lead yourself astray pretty easily if you start imprinting your own ethics and your own ideas about why someone might do this. The best thing to do is maybe to look at what are other similar peoples who you do have some modern knowledge about, and their traditions and why they might uh, pick that particular day. The winter solstice, for example, is the shortest day of the year, right? It's the longest night. And so it's a tomb. So someone's died there. Why does sunrise on the shortest day of the year? You know, what does that mean? And I, I, like I said, I like to prefer to not speculate. I just like to point out this is clearly intentional. And sometimes that's all that we can really say, right? People wanted this alignment to be there, and so they built it into the structure. Um, Going to another structure that people often like to consider, what are the astronomical alignments of? We've got the Great Pyramids of Giza, often called the Giza Necropolis, because these pyramids were tombs for pharaohs. And one of the there's been so many different um, claims about their astronomical alignments, and the truth is there's no evidence that any of those things are intentional or meant. The only thing that you can really strictly say is that the pyramids were aligned east, west, north, south, so they were aligned with the cardinal directions, and that automatically creates solar alignments, because equinoxes happen when the sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west. So if you align your building east-west, there will be equinox alignments. And whether or not there's an intention, some kind of hierophany that's intended there, it's really hard to say. But one of the things that is kind of interesting is that if you take a line from the center of the first pyramid that was built, the Pyramid of Khufu, and you draw a line between the sun rises at the extremes, the solstices. So sun rises at the solstices and sun sets at the solstices. All right, there's your lines. The next pyramid that was built, the Pyramid of Khafre, was built in such a way that it just clears those lines of sight. So it's it doesn't obscure the view of the sunrise and the sunset of the first pyramid. Now, and so that was pointed out to me, and I was like, okay, well, that's interesting and seems kind of intentional because it's just beyond the range, right? But then I thought, well, but if that was your point, was to build the pyramid so that it doesn't obscure the view of sunrises and sunsets from the other pyramid, why wouldn't you just put it directly south, right? If you put it directly south, that also accomplishes the same thing. And maybe there was something about that area south that wasn't good for building. I don't know, I'm not an architect, but you know, that would have been another way to do it. Maybe just someone thought that's a cool flourish, so let's put it on this cool angle. The third pyramid, it probably was meant to have the same arrangement, but they kind of ended up not building it to its full scale of the other two. So it's still kind of lies along that path if it had been full scale, but since it's not full scale, it's a bit beyond the same diagonal. But again, that's like one that we know is there. It seems intentional and it's clear, and that's kind of it for these in terms of directly intentional. There's lots of like accidental things, or I shouldn't say accidental because we don't know. It could have been intentional, but um, it's not obviously deliberate. And then there's this one, Stonehenge. Go back to the British Isles. Everyone loves to talk about Stonehenge. And there's several things to know about Stonehenge. One is that there's no such thing as one Stonehenge. It was in use and constructed over 1,000-year period, and it was never done. It was always being constructed and deconstructed. Stones were always being moved. And so there was never like one particular way that this thing uh, stood for any great length of time. And it's another one of these places where there'll be a lot of people who want to claim particular alignments with the sun or with different stars. And the only alignment, again, that is clearly intentional is that the main entryway to the circle is again facing the winter solstice sunrise. And that again, we don't quite know why. There's the uses of this could have changed over the ages for all we know. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that there's a lot of um, graves near the site, and when they've examined the remains of the people in those graves, they've noticed that a lot of them had injuries that they apparently had died of. And one speculation is that maybe Stonehenge was used as a place of healing, and people who were, injured may come there to seek healing or something like that. But again, it's one of these places where there's not a lot of memory left to know exactly what the people who used it were using it for and what their intentions were. But we do know that they aligned it to the summer or the winter solstice sunrise. One of the places where we do have a bit more knowledge, because there are living people who still carry on some of the oral traditions, is over in the Americas, in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. There's several structures. One of them is called Casa Riconada, and it's this circular kiva, which is half in and half out of the ground. And it's a place of ceremony where the whole community would gather. And there are niches that are carved into the walls, and there are several alignments with the seasonal motions of the sun, so that sunrise or sunset on those special quarter days of the year, you would get the sun lining up with those niches, right? So sometimes people talk about these as if they're like a calendar and you're keeping track of those days. But in general, that's not what these buildings were generally used for, right? So, because in order to build them, you have to already know the motions of the sun. So it's not like you're observing and discovering the seasons of the sun this way, because you have to already know what the seasonal motions are in order to build it, right? So a lot of these types of buildings, they're more used for ceremony. One of the actually examples in Chaco Canyon, which is interesting, was there was for a while anyway, there was these three rocks that sat on top of Fajada Butte here in the canyon, and these three slabs of sunstone behind them on the rock wall was found this spiral carving. And it was noticed that there would be slivers of light that would get through the rocks and they would carve out and make some very specific shapes around the spirals on the quarter days. And so you can see those over here on the spring equinox, on the summer solstice, on the fall equinox, and the winter solstice. And this is one of those cases where this is not used for public ceremony because it's a it's not an easy place to get to, and only one person at a time can really observe this. So it's one of these cases where probably the stones fell of their own accord, and some clever person thought, I'm watching the sun go through there, and thought, I could actually draw a configuration here that would mark the passage of the sun. The very sad thing about this is that this site was open for tourism and by the 1980s, there had been so many tourists walking around the site that they shifted the stones enough that the effect no longer occurs. So, yeah, that's unfortunate to say the least. The Temple of Kukulkan is the one that I started with, and I wanted to mention one other thing about it. It's a monument to the sun in many ways. It has lots of solar alignments with it, but one of the things that's kind of fun is that it has four sides, and each side has a stairway to the top. Each stairway has 91 steps, and so that's 364 steps. And then there's a final step to go inside the temple on the top, so 365. So it represents the solar year in that numerical way. The Maya loved their numbers. They were mathematicians first and foremost of all things, and whenever they could play number games in their architecture, they did it. All right, it's 4:50, so I wanted to save this time to yeah, do some question and answer.
Feel free to unmute or just ask your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Thank you for that awesome talk. That was super interesting, Bryan.
My pleasure.
A quick hand raise from Benjamin. I don't know if that was intended, or Gwen, if you want to go ahead.
I did have one question about the how particularly this temple. I know there's 365 steps, but we account for leap year. Was that ever accounted for back then? I know it was added later, but I don't know when particularly. So,
So I have some slides on this, so it depends on how much people want to want to hang on for it. But let me just jump. Here we go. So the Maya had several different calendars that they kept for different purposes, and their solar calendar was called I shouldn't say was, is. People still use it. It's called the Hab. At least it's called the Hab in the Yucatec Maya language. And it's 365 days. It's a cycle of 18 named days or 18 named months. They're not a month long, and 20 numbered days. And then there's one extra month of 5 days called the Layeb. And so that gives you your 365 days. Now, of course, because the tropical year is 365.2422, that means that this is calendar slips with respect to solar alignments every 4 years, right? And cultures deal with this in a variety of different ways. The Gregorian calendar that we are all familiar with throws in the leap day, right? Uses the leap day, February 29th, every 4 years to kind of catch up. What I think is really interesting is the Maya appear to have not been as concerned with the notion of keeping solar alignments on the same date as they were in keeping the same rhythm of the dates themselves. And so instead of changing the calendar, they just tracked the slip, right? They just knew that the date of the solstice is going to change by 1 day every 4 years, and they tracked it, right? So it's just a different way of thinking about it, right? So there's the I want the solstice to always happen on the same day, or let me just calculate when is the solstice going to happen, and it's going to happen it's going to happen a day later every 4 years, right? One of the ways we've been able to see how they calculated this is there's an inscription that calculates this number 1508 and 1507. That is the number of Hobbs that, or I should say, it's the number of tropical years that go into that number of Hobbs. If you divide that out, you actually get 365.2422. That's only 1 second different from the tropical day. So that tells us that the Maya knew the length of the tropical day to extreme precision. And it, so it's not a matter of, oh, we weren't aware, and so our calendar is inaccurate. It's what was important to us was that the calendar maintained its rhythm as opposed to keeping the date on the same or keeping the alignment on the same day. Question in the chat: as more discoveries were made on the sun, did its symbolism change over time, like the geocentric and heliocentric model? Oh, April, that's such a good question. And in my cultural astronomy course, I spend a very long time talking about the geocentric to heliocentric movement. And one of the characters who's really important to tell in that story is Johannes Kepler, because Kepler had the he was in seminary school and training to be a priest, and so he was very, very religious, but he also thought of the sun itself as a symbol of God. And so he was very into the heliocentric model because of that kind of religious conviction, right? And and he came up with his theories of planetary motion, which all depended on the sun being at the center of things. He didn't really run afoul with the church the way Galileo did, because his writings were all mathematical and theoretical, and nobody understood them but a few academics, right? The reason that Galileo got into trouble is because he wrote in common Italian so that everybody could read it, and he also made fun of the local bishop in his writings. So the church went after him. Um, so for sure, yeah, our ideas change about the sun as our cultural notions change about it, right? Um, and I think that's a story not just about the sun, but about, all of the astronomical objects as well. Yeah, Kishore, go ahead. What's your question?
Hi. So it's my understanding that depending on your latitude, if you track the path, the trajectory that the tip of a shadow, like a stick on the ground, traces, like that can, like give you different paths. Were there any kind of cultural phenomena or like explanations for the path of the, shadow throughout the day? And was that something that people actually, meticulously tracked and like made observations, made measurements?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of archaeoastronomers especially try to like reverse engineer how some of these structures may have been originally constructed. And what you've just described is, it's got a technical term, because of course it does. It's called a gnomon, and it's just a stick in the ground, right? A vertical stick in the ground. It casts a shadow, of course, and as the sun moves through the sky, the shadow points opposite to it. When the shadow is shortest is when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, which is defined as noon. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, then that shadow points directly north, right? So, for example, if you're trying to get an accurate reading on north because you want to orient your building to north, then you can put down a bunch of gnomons. You can track their shadows when they're where you can mark where they're shortest, and then they're pointing due north, right? So for sure people did this. It's we don't have like the blueprints and the engineering records, but we know that people use gnomons in a variety of different ways. The idea of a sundial is basically just a gnomon that's tilted at angles, and then you kind of have markings to kind of track the motion of that shadow across the day, right?
All right, thank you.
Sure.
I was going to ask if you know of any specific like relics that have been like recorded for the different civilizations that built the monuments around the eclipses and the equinox. Like if we could see like a beforehand before they built the monument in full, how they calculated the exact position it needed to be.
I can't think of any particular artifacts. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. That just means that they're not in my brain at the moment. Um, yeah, I can't think of any.
That was probably less well preserved than the actual monument as well.
Yeah, well, and I gave you examples of really ancient monuments, and the problem with ancient things is that time destroys stuff, right? And so there's not a lot, I mean, one of the reasons we know what we know is because some people wrote stuff into rock, and rock erodes a lot slower than other things, right? If people wrote stuff on paper, paper degrades really quickly, and yeah. Randolph.
Hi, Brian. Yeah, the thought wave occurred, maybe a comment or so. Maybe you want to elaborate on that. When you talked about kind of that the sun gets carried by chariots through the sky in various cultures.
Right.
Obviously, the culture coming up with that story must have known the chariot, which
Oh,
and I think kind of to a culture which kind of sees another um, yeah, people's coming with chariots, probably war chariots. That must have been very impressive to them. And I just had the thought, yeah, such an event uh, can easily spread and therefore kind of maybe carry that story that the sun is carried by a very powerful thing, a chariot, through the sky.
uh,
But I wonder if kind of there's possibility to kind of track the spread of chariots, kind of the invention
yeah.
of a chariot and use in either warfare or um, merchant or kind of commerce, if that coincides with the spread of that story of the sun being carried by the chariot.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't actually thought about that. We should track the history of chariots. And, I don't know, for example, if those kinds of structures had several independent, uh, inventions across the world. The depiction, for example, of Shiha's carriage, is not quite like it's not like a Roman chariot or a battle chariot. It's more of a something that you carry royalty on, right? And so is that inspired by contact, or was that an independent invention? Yeah. So yeah, now you've given me something else to investigate. Thanks, Randall.
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah. April asks, where can I learn about astronomy in relation to culture and society? I mean, there are lots of books. Um, I saw my friend Andy Fracknoy here. Andy actually built a really nice um, bibliography of some resources that we have on one of our older websites. You know what? I should share that in the HelioHub. I'm on the HelioHub myself, so someone ping me on the HelioHub, and I'll share the link to that bibliography of resources, because actually I think that's a really fantastic place to start.
All right, I think I'm gonna stop the recording here, but thank you for the amazing talk, Brian, and for answering all everyone's questions. I just put the Discord link in the chat, so if you guys aren't in it, feel free to join. We'd love to have you there. And Dr. Bryan Mendez is in the HelioHub Discord too. We have a bunch of other experts, and yeah, I'm gonna end it there. But if anyone has any other questions, maybe we can stay for just a few more minutes. But thank you, Dr. Mendez.